Hello everybody, welcome to Picnic, welcome to the European Journalism Center event here. New venue, we'll see what it turns out to be. We've been doing Picnic now for 5 years. We started in the Westerraasfabrik and we went to all kinds of places with the Picnic organization. And I remember when we first started in 2006, I think we had pretty much exactly 3 people in the audience. So you multiplied substantially here, obviously, and welcome. So we have a whole session till 5 something, and we have a coffee break in between, so there's one break opportunity there for you. And just quickly introduce what the European Journalism Center does. We're based in Maastricht, which is as non-Dutch as it gets in Holland, I guess, but it is still within the country. And we've been celebrating our 20th anniversary in the summer, and we've been training journalists and looking into the future of journalism, and been trying to come up with curriculum ideas and ideas on how the industry is progressing or not progressing or retracting, however you want to see it. And we do quite a lot of things. I'll just show a few slides before I introduce my speakers here. Basically, everything you want to know is on this webpage, ejc.net. It's the main hub for everything. Everything is linked from there. In the right-hand corner, if you don't go there on a regular basis, everything we've done in the last couple of days, you see in the box called Latest Updates. And it's quite a huge resource, as you will find out when you go there. Just like to draw your attention to 2 little things, or major things if you like. One is we're running a major resource on data-driven journalism, which we've been doing here at the Picnic last year. We also did a book with O'Reilly on a data journalism handbook that is as a book, as an e-book, but also is available for free. We also have another book for free on the website about Arab Spring and social media. If you want to have a look, there's some copies here. You might want to come up to me and ask, and I can show you how to download it. So this is the data journalism website we're running. We've done a big competition together with the Global Editors Network and Google on Data Journalism Awards, and we got about 350 applications worldwide for a best practice of data journalism, and it was quite a substantial endeavor. It's the first time we did this, and we are set to do it again and try to get another round of funding as well from Google, hopefully to do this. And if you have a look at the winning items, you will see how strong this data journalism thing has been developing over the last 2-3 years. And for the occasion today, we started this website as well. Emergency Journalism is a website on all things to do with crisis mapping, crisis and disaster responses, or what is the role of the journalism in the coverage of this. And we're going to build this into a resource like we did with the data journalism website on basically a one-stop shop for all needs, all best practice cases, link resources, and make it into a container, useful container for the whole topic. That is just, we're starting this year, but you see this is emerging big time everywhere. So stay tuned for more stuff on crisis mapping and crowdsourcing and curation of data gathered from the field. And one last thing I would like to draw your attention to is we have a photo competition called Click About It. It's an international photo competition, and we have some very, very nice entries there. You might want to find the time to have a look there. It's one of the, we run about, I don't know, I lost track actually. We run about, I think, 12 or 15 websites on all kinds of topics, but these are the most recent ones, so I want to quickly draw your attention to that one. Having said that, coming to the topic at hand, I'd like to introduce 2 people for the first round. One is Charlie Beckett he's the director of the Polis Institute in London at the London School of Economics. Also, what I learned last night is he's become the director now of the Department of Media and Communication at LSE. So I was joking with him, the niche just disappeared. And he's in the mainstream academic hub, if you want now. And the other colleague here is David Clinch. He is an editorial director of Storyful from Ireland, but having flown in from Atlanta. So 2 very seasoned colleagues of mine. I'm very happy they could make it, both with a substantial experience in television and then changing over to other things after television. There's a life after television, so as I learned myself. So there is a life after television, and I would ask Charlie to start this presentation, and we take it from there. So we have 2 short presentations, a quick round of discussions, and then we continue with the next item. So Charlie, you go.
Hi everybody. Yeah, I'm now plugged in. Great. Hello everybody. Amazing turnout. It's an amazing event, full stop really. When I tweeted earlier that I was going to be talking about Kate Middleton and the topless photos, and you obviously believed me, but I won't be, I'm afraid. What I'm going to try and do instead is give a overview. Later in the session today, you're going to get lots of fantastic case studies of people doing exciting journalism, for want of a better word. I mean, it's broader than journalism, really. And they're going to be having those practical, very creative examples of what you can do. I'm going to take a few minutes to try and put it in a broader context, which is going to look at, if you like, the sort of social, and in a way, the kind of political background to all these changes. As Willy mentioned, my background is in television. I was a TV news person at places like the BBC and ITN for over 20 years, and then went to the LSE to set up Polis, which is this think tank. And the main work we've done has been looking at what I call media change, new media, new technologies, but how it impacts on societies. So we're really interested, one big area we look at is the role of journalism and media in what we call kind of humanitarian communications. So, reporting on disasters, but also coverage of development issues, and more broadly, that idea of the role of media in international relations. And of course, there are extraordinary stories that we're seeing at the moment. You only have to think about the current row about that film and the riots that it provoked in the Middle East to see how important this all is. I'm very enthusiastic, basically. I'm an old fart by background, but I'm a very, very enthusiastic person about what I call network journalism. In fact, my first book was called Supermedia, because I think that the new forms of journalism have, if you like, a kind of superpowers. Put most simply, my idea of network journalism is that if you take perhaps a professional journalist, and journalist is a very broad term, if you add in public participation in some form, if you add in the new technologies that we have, then you end up with better journalism. So those new technologies allow us new techniques to create new narratives that are more informative, they're more interactive, and they're much more multidimensional. But before we get too optimistic and overexcited, I think it is important, as I say, to look at the context for this networked journalism. So the first bit I'm going to look at is the idea of changing society. Now, I haven't got time to go into all the research that we do at the LSE about how society is changing and impacting on media. So what I want to concentrate on really is the relationship between the journalist, the technology, and the citizen. And I think it's very important to remember we're in a festival here where a lot of creative people, a lot of technologically creative people, but I would argue that it's not the technology that's going to determine how people use that media. I want you to have a look at this picture. It's a family. Anybody know what they're doing? Can anybody tell me what you think they're doing? Hands up. Come on, behave yourselves. Hands up. Pardon? iPad. Yeah, what do you think they're doing on the iPad?
YouTube.
Sorry?
YouTube.
You think YouTube, you think pictures. Why do you think of pictures? Why do you think they're looking at photos?
Because they're all interested in the same
Exactly, that's brilliant. Yeah, and I think when I look at this photo, this family, it's actually my family. That way I've got Creative Commons rights to the photos. It's my family, and when you look at that family, there's some interesting questions. The first one was, what are they doing? But I think much more interesting is, why are they doing it? Is it a good or bad thing that that family are all looking at an iPad? You know, shouldn't they be talking to each other? You know, shouldn't they be interacting? How does it change them, the fact that they are all together looking at an iPad? Now, these are actually social, and in some ways they're kind of ethical or political questions. And what shapes the answer to those questions isn't the technology, it will be other forces or other trends, other factors. So, for example, my mother-in-law, the granny, bottom left, well, she's there partly because of scientific medical improvements. She's quite old. Longevity has increased hugely, and she loves iPads. The little girl to the right there, you know, she's able to look at the iPad. She loves iPads. She uses it all the time because she's taught how to use these technologies in school. And she's in a Western country where it's highly developed education, and girls do very well at school. The two women who are there, they're particularly interesting, I think, because, you know, they are women and gender is very important. They're there because they are both highly successful executives who live very, very busy lives, very time-poor lives. And in fact, one of them actually they live in different countries. So that whole family relationship is a product of globalization. And indeed, one of them actually lives in Holland, in Amsterdam. That's a little Dutch girl. And so that family, the reason they're using that bit of technology and the way that they're using it and the value that it gives to them is a product of those circumstances and those trends. And in a sense, you know, the iPad is incidental. How they use the technology is based on their own values, their own personal histories, and their own circumstances. And I would argue if you understand that, then you'll be much more likely to come up with the kind of journalism or media that's going to be relevant to them, not just in topic, but in the kind of format, the platform and the style, and all the rest. So, now bearing that in mind, you know, nice kind of futuristic idea, let's have a think about this other background issue that I was asked to look at, ownership. So if you accept that social trends do drive media consumption, if you accept that journalism's now networked, then ownership changes. Now, in an old-fashioned sense, media is still owned by public services organisations like the BBC and private businesses like Rupert and News Corporation. Now, these organisations are changing. You're seeing new organisations, you know, like Google, like Facebook, and I would argue that Facebook, for example, Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook, is a major player in journalism and in media more generally. When you think of the way that we now access and use information through social networks and through search, then these companies are now as important in many ways as News Corporation. And these structural changes are really important to you as creators of media. But they are still, these ones anyway, are media corporations in the traditional sense. Now, of course, there are also new media magnates. You all know the guy on the left, I assume. Hands up who doesn't know the guy on the left. Okay, brave to say so. And luckily, I have the answer for you. It's Julian Assange, of course, from WikiLeaks. And quick advert, my book, my latest book anyway, my new book is about WikiLeaks and its significance in media. And it's on sale, Willie tells me, at the bookshop. So he's important, I think we all know that. The guys on the right, that's the Syrian opposition. And I would argue that their use of media has turned them into a kind of media organisation. They're putting stuff on YouTube, they're putting stuff into social networks, they're creating their own journalism, and they're creating material for journalism. So I think that makes them a media organisation. And then there's this girl at the bottom, and she's another media revolutionary. She's, anybody recognise Martha Payne? Any Brits here might recognise Martha, yeah. She is a blogger. She's a 9-year-old in Scotland, which is a country to the north of England. And she had a blog about school dinners. Now, I don't know, in the Netherlands, I don't know how good or bad your school dinners are, but she had one that was called Never Seconds, which reviewed the food in the school canteen, and sometimes it was quite rude. And the local authority, Argyll and Bute Council, banned her from blogging. They wouldn't let her take her laptop into school. Now, of course, at that point, you get the traditional witch hunt on Twitter. The mob arose in protest against what the council did. And literally within a few hours, the council had to reverse that decision and allow Martha to blog again. And the ending was particularly happy from a sort of social media perspective, because she then used that notoriety or that fame that she'd got because of that controversy. And she ended up raising £100,000 online for school dinners or catering for poor kids around the world. So these are all examples of new actors in the media environment. They're all change makers, and they are the new kids literally on the block. And because you don't know what they're going to do next, or you don't know where the next one of those is coming from, that makes them, well, to big media, that makes them dangerous. It certainly makes them interesting because no one predicted them, but here they are. And of course, there are many, many other forces at work. The new report from European Journalism Centre about social media and revolutions. You're familiar with the Occupy use of social media. You're probably all familiar with the Coney 2012 campaign. I've got a report coming out in a month on that. And you're probably familiar with the use of BlackBerry Messenger by the rioters in England the summer before last. And what you see with all these new players is that we now live in an age of uncertainty and complexity. In the real world, my goodness, we live in a world of uncertainty and complexity. You only have to think of the economic situation. But the media world itself is now much more unpredictable and complicated. There is a changing diversity of possible media producers. And you only have to think of your own personal media use. Just think of the number of possible sources that you have, the number of possible devices that you have to create your or consume your own media. But there is another sense of ownership, of control, that is changing, and that's actually the nature of news or information in itself. Because I would argue that news used to be a product. I used to make something called Channel 4 News that went out at 7 o'clock and you watched it and then it disappeared. So news used to be that product. I would argue it's now very much more a process, a continual process. News used to be a manufacturing industry. And I would argue that now news and information is a service industry. The internet means that you can't retain control over your content. You can paywall it, you can copyright it, you can encode it, but the narratives themselves are the property of everyone the moment that you make them public. So, just to conclude, in the future, the important thing for media to own will be these kind of things: brand, reputation, skills, and above all, perhaps, a relationship where you're adding value. Everything we do now, we have to think, are we doing something that somebody else isn't, or are we doing it significantly better? Because people can access it so easily themselves. So, and critically for that relationship, that final added value relationship, it's a new kind of relationship in that it's about trust, transparency, and again, keep repeating that added value that you're bringing to people's lives. So, if you understand the social context of journalism, if you understand the new meanings of ownership of news, and if you understand this new networked relationship with the public, then I think you can start to think about building a business model and creating content that people want and that they might even pay for. Thanks very much.
My name is David Clinch, and I'm the editorial director of Storyful, and I'll explain what that is in a second. I have been a journalist for 25 years or so, started in England working at ITN, then went 22 years ago to Atlanta to work at CNN, and worked on the international desk there for more than 20 years, which, if you're a journalist, is one of the most exciting places you could possibly work in the world. You're at the center of news 24 hours a day, constantly talking to people all over the world, and you also get to go home and sit by the swimming pool, as opposed to the people like Christiane Amanpour and others who are getting shot at. So if you're a journalist and you're looking for the best job in the world, working on the international desk at CNN is definitely there. But I chose to leave CNN 2.5 years ago, at the height of my career, at the worst probable economy for the journalism world, certainly in the United States in my memory, because I believed that the future of journalism was not really possible within the constraints of a traditional news organization. No, at least not then. Maybe it will be in the future. But I left 2.5 years ago, having seen while I was at CNN, especially in the last 5 or 6 years there, the reality that every time there was a story, whether it was Iran, whether it was an earthquake in Haiti or China, or anything that was happening anywhere in the world, traditional news gathering was happening, traditional news production was happening, but something had changed. Every story at the heart of it had social media content. And social media content could be YouTube videos, somebody taking a picture, it could be an amateur journalist, it could be a local professional journalist, it could be an NGO. Content on the web was playing an essential part in every single story that we were covering. And at CNN and other news organizations, and Matthew can certainly attest to this at the BBC, great efforts were being made to try and harness the power of that social media content, and those efforts continue. And I certainly applaud those efforts within traditional news gathering. But I decided to leave CNN and partner with Mark Little, who's based in Ireland, to start Storyful, with the idea that what if you started from scratch? What if the only kind of content you had access to was on the web? What if you didn't have production, didn't have shows, didn't have anchors, and all you had was the web to cover the news every day? And so we started with a basic concept that if we could build a new news organization, a news agency essentially, that could capture 3 essential problems that existed. What is the content? Is it real? Verification. Everything is out there, but is it real, right? And the second real problem is access. Can you use it? Do you have permission to use it? Who owns it? We're talking here about ownership. One of the key parts of ownership in the future is not just ownership of big media companies, but who owns the content? If somebody puts a picture on the web, who owns that? And who can use it, right? And then the third part was, and this is horrible, it's terrible, how do you make money out of it, right? I have been listening and watching people talk about the future of journalism for the last 30 years, and nobody likes to talk about that dirty little horrible secret, is you actually have to make money. So we at Storyful have built a business around solving those key issues. How do you find content? Discovery. How do you verify it? And how do you get access to it? And we provide a service to most of the major news companies in the world, and we work at partnership with others, and we also work in partnership with all the biggest web companies in the world, like Google, YouTube, and Twitter, and others, because they own the platforms. The past news platforms were television shows or were 24-hour news networks. The present news platforms include all of those things, plus the entire web is a news platform. But you need to curate it, you need to understand what's there, and you need to know what you're seeing in a context. So we have 3 mantras, basically, at Storyful. One is that traditional journalism is essential to the future of journalism. Anyone who tells you that social media or the web is the answer to everything is full of crap, right? It's not true, because if you try to do journalism, now whether you're a local individual or a big news organization, in some way that takes out the traditional processes of journalism, contextualization, understanding, verification, connecting one thing to another. If you remove that, you failed for a start. So don't even try to do journalism without being a journalist or training or learning how to be a journalist. The second thing is, We always believe there's somebody closer to the story. There is always somebody closer to the story. So while you have traditional journalism, and you should never abandon that, you also cannot think that the person who's the great journalist with 30 years experience, who's sitting 300 miles away or 400 miles away in Beirut, can tell you exactly what's happening on the ground in Syria. Maybe they can, and maybe they will add value, but they are not there. And sometimes even when they are there, they're in one part of the city, they're not in the other part of the city. So there is always somebody closer to the story. If you can identify that person who's closer, if you can verify who they are, contextualize the content and information that they are supplying, and combine it with traditional journalism, that is the future of journalism, right? It is not just doing it the old way, and it is not just doing it some new way with an iPhone and think you've got all the answers. It has to be a combination of those two things. And the third thing is, again, dirty little secret, how do you make that a sustainable business? And talking about ownership, one of the things that we do is we work in, as I said, in business and in partnership with most of the major news companies in the world, and they pay us, and that's great. But we're never going to make all the money we want to make just working with traditional news organizations, because it's a very challenging business environment, and it's hard for anyone to make money in that. But it needs to be done, because that's the way the world is structured. The media industry is structured that way. But the challenge there, not just for us, but for all traditional news organizations, is you're trying to squeeze, you know, Charlie talked about it being a production process. You're trying to, what used to be sort of fairly easy, all the news is out there, nobody else has seen it except us, the journalists. We're going to open the gate and show you what we think you should see. Well, that's not the case anymore. By the time any newscast gets on, even a 24-hour newscast, by the time that newscast gets on, thousands or hundreds of thousands of people already know quite a lot of information about what you're just about to tell them. So what value are you adding as a traditional news organization is one challenge. The other challenge is, even if you do a great job, as CNN does, BBC, Al Jazeera, and others do, of bringing in social media, you're still essentially challenged by the fact that you're squeezing all of this amazing content that's out there into your chosen branded environment, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, because that's the way the media industry is right now. But our view at Storyful is that we want to work with those media companies, we want to support that, they want to support us. It's a great combination of old and new working together. The older traditional companies are changing in real time. We're playing a part in that. That's all good. But if you stop there and do not recognize the fact that whether Google likes it or Twitter likes it, or as Charlie said, Facebook likes it, they are playing a role in the media and the news business. Now, they may not want to play that role, they may have different views of whether they should play a role, but the fact is they are holding and hosting content which is newsworthy on a scale which has never been seen before. And no news organization can currently challenge those big web companies in terms of how much content they have. But can you find it? Do you know what you're looking at when you go on YouTube? Is it real? Is it not real? What are you interested in? You're interested in politics, or you're interested in weather, or you're interested in sports. If you go to Twitter, can you find that? Maybe you're following the right people, maybe you're not. Maybe you have a list, maybe you don't have a list. The approach that we take is that an essential part of the future of news is what we call the human algorithm. If you only trust the algorithms of these big web companies, you're not seeing the whole picture. The human algorithm is the skills of journalism that we provide and all of the major news organizations provide to know what a really good source is. This YouTube video is different from this YouTube video. This one is real, this one is not real. This person on Twitter is real. This thing that you just saw on Facebook is real, this is not. And being able to harness and curate all of that information in a way that makes it understandable for an audience is an essential part of the future of news. That doesn't in any way change that you might want to still put it in a branded environment on CNN, BBC, or somewhere else. But what it does do is, for the whole portion of society that is now consuming their news in real time on their phones or on the web, you are giving people a much, much greater chance of finding valuable content. So as well as our news business, We work in partnership, for instance, with YouTube, and we do YouTube/politics and YouTube/human rights. And if you look at those just as 2 examples, we work with YouTube to find the best content, verify it, and then arrange it in a really easy to understand way, so that if you're interested in politics and you want to go to YouTube and find politics video, you go to YouTube Politics and it's all there. Traditional news, what the campaigns are saying, and the user-generated content that comes from the campaign trail. The troika of content, right, is all in one place. And we think that's an essential part of the future of news, because if you only concentrate on, yes, there's lots of new social media content, but we're still essentially just squeezing it into the product of a traditional news end product of a show or even a website, you're missing an opportunity. Because in the future, increasingly, the young people who are like my kids and Charlie's kids who are consuming information wherever they find it, whenever they find it, we owe it to them as journalists, and anyone who does not value the role of journalism is missing the point of what we're talking about here. This is not about the power of Google or the power of Facebook or anything. The power of the information that is hosted on those platforms will only be truly revealed if journalists do their job. If they learn the new skills and apply them to those platforms in exactly the same way as they did to the shows that they're producing. Those skills are absolutely essential. And we owe it to that next generation, as we owe it to the audience right now, to make sure that they understand what they're seeing on those web platforms. How many of you, I know I get this all the time living in America, somebody tells you, I saw on Facebook that Michelle Obama said this. Did she really say that? They read it on their phone, on the way to talking to you, or somebody told them who told them, or SMS'd them something which is third-hand information. But people will believe it, not because they're not smart, but because that's the way they're consuming their information, and nobody has filtered it. And that, again, is the horrible sort of dirty secret of what journalism is. It is filtering. It is gatekeeping to a certain extent. No, our jobs as journalists are not the same locked gate that we only let people in when we want to let them in. The gate is, if you want to put it this way, open already. But we're still standing at that gate as journalists, whether we're a big news organization or a small one like Storyful, and we have to do whatever we can possibly do to make sure that this massive flow of information that is out there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, is in some degree filtered and contextualized so people can understand it. One of the other things that I want to stress is, and one of the things that we do at Storyful, is that we don't just stop with news organizations. We work closely with NGOs, and we work closely with big web companies. So for instance, we work closely with Google Crisis Response. Whenever there is a major crisis like a typhoon or an earthquake or anything like that, the maps and the crisis pages that they produce now include a lot of video that we curate, and most importantly, and verify, most importantly, we geotag it. And we have a vision of the future of content being consumed on a map. So that every day you could look at the area that you're interested in, and whether you're interested in NGO work or news or sports or weather, you would home in, and all of the information, whether it's from Twitter or from a traditional news organization or from YouTube, is easily consumable based on geolocation. Because that really is the other opportunity of the mantra that there's always somebody closer to the story. Because that brings you closer, and you can see exactly what's happening on the ground. Not just in real time, but if you do it properly, and I'll show you some of the maps later, I'll bring them up so you can see them. Let's say you're an NGO and you're interested in whether Hurricane Isaac left lasting damage in Haiti. Well, you could do lots and lots of research, or you could just go to the map that we worked with Google on, and it's all there. All of the video, the NGO video, the news video, everything. The news companies have left. The NGOs have seriously downsized. They're not there anymore. But the video is still there, and you can go and look at it. The Arab Spring, if you want an archive of thousands of verified videos from Syria, Egypt, Tunisia, everywhere, to the back of the Arab Spring, we have that. And we were talking earlier about the value of archive. So, in conclusion, the concept that we have at Storyful is absolutely based on traditional journalism. even though we have started from scratch without the hierarchy and without all of the layers and all of the structure of a traditional news organization, we fully embrace all of the skill set and rules of journalism. But having said that, the world is our oyster. We don't have to get the news on at 6 o'clock. We don't have to not look at some content because it comes from some source or not another source. We can look anywhere and everywhere there is valuable content and verify it in real time. And that, to me, is the most exciting thing that I, in my 25, 30 years of journalism, have ever experienced. And I think it is the most exciting period for journalism that we have seen in my career. So I hope that you all, if you have questions, will ask them later, and we'll be prepared to answer them, and I'll show you some more details of what we do. But the changing role of branding and ownership has just begun. It would be really interesting for us all to come back in a couple of years and see exactly where all of this ends up. And I intend to be along for the ride. Thank you.
I'm quite impressed actually by having, this looking into the future so much, and then looking for next generation applications and the stuff that is coming up, and then coming back to very traditional journalism skills at the same time. So I'm wondering, what does it mean for recruiting? What are you looking for in guys when you hire them?
That's a great question. And I am accepting resumes, by the way. So, I mean, not answering your question directly, but it's interesting, is every major media company that we work with at Storyful, so including all of the major news companies in the world for the most part in one form or another, every time we go into a meeting and we leave, before I leave the building, somebody has sent me their resume because they want to come and work for us. And that's really exciting, but it's a huge challenge for us to find people who have, you might want to work for us, but do you have the skill set to do verification of social media content and the experience of traditional news content? And are you savvy enough about the technology to know what you're doing? That's a very difficult skill set. It's a hard, if you look at the big media organizations, even the ones that have done a very good job of getting people doing this kind of thing, it's still a very small group. I mean, I used to refer to it at CNN as the social media insurgency within CNN. And that fight still goes on within CNN and everywhere else. But it is very hard. And some of the best ones have those jobs at traditional news organizations. I'd like to poach them to work for me. We cannot just hire somebody because they're young and cheap and want to work for us. If we find the right person, they have to have that combination. It's a tough combination to get the new media skills and the traditional skills in one place. But also, it's very important that it not be too much of one set of skills and not enough of the other. It has to be a balance. There are some people who are very, very good at social media and verification and that kind of thing, but they they've never been out in the field. They don't know how journalism really works in the real world. So it's a tough combination. But we're 30 plus people at Storyful now, and every person we hire has to create pretty massive value. So again, that sort of starting from scratch is also in some ways a model for how you build a news organization, because we would love to be 300, but each and every person who's added has to bring a lot with them. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. I mean, we have the same issue.
Yeah, it's
I was
tough.
wondering about it then
This is our dashboard, by the way.
From the academic side of you, how you reflect that at university? How you reflect it in curriculum? Yeah. Is it reflected in curriculum?
Well, I think one of the things that's going to change, if you think about, I mean, I agree absolutely with what they were saying, that if you want to work in that industry, then you have to be able to do, unfortunately, you have to be doing the old stuff. So you do have to still know about the world. You still have to have kind of writing or visual or text skills. And then you need, on top of that, you probably need either an ability to code or design or just a sense of how networks work. So you need additional skills. But I think above all, you need to be able to adapt. So even if you have all those skills today, or a good selection of them, what if it all bloody changes again in 2 years' time? Well, you'd have wasted all your time if you went to a journalism school and they taught you how to be a journalist for now. What you need to be taught or need to learn is how to adapt and how to take those core ideas and adapt them. And in that sense, what we do, we don't teach people how to be a journalist at the LSE. In the same way, the LSE doesn't actually really teach you how to be an economist. It teaches you how to think about those things. And I think that really what you need to do is obviously is to have all these wonderful skills if you can pick those up. But you need also to be able to think, what I was saying in my talk about that relationship between content, consumers, and your particular platform, for example, or your particular network. And that isn't necessarily profound, it's just being imaginative and open-minded, all those things that journalists weren't in the past.
Maybe a question here also about collaboration. It used to be when I was brought up in journalism, you would have this room for yourself. You would close the door and you would not necessarily talk to anybody, maybe go for lunch, but be very single, lonely guy behind your typewriter at the time. So is it a more collaborative thing, or you still think it is individuals?
Well, I would say probably the answer is a bit of both, in that I would never want to take, some of the geniuses of our business out of their closed rooms where they're doing great work and force them to do collaboration for the sake of collaboration. And I mean, we all know who the great writers are and the great journalists are, and some of them are able to sort of adapt and bring more of a networked approach, but some of them aren't. And you should know, and this is important, I should have said this earlier, I hate social media. I absolutely hate it. It's horrible. It's just tons and tons of rubbish all the time. I only am interested in it when it's really valuable. So if you try and take somebody who is a traditional journalist and likes the closed-door approach and just say, you've got to do this and throw them in, I've seen that fail so many times. But on the other hand, there are people like Nick Kristof and others who work for the New York Times who they're naturals. They love to network because they see the value of it. So I think there's probably a role for both, and I think that you see it fail in both directions, that if you sort of take somebody who's a natural networker and then sort of try to force them to go off and close the door, that doesn't necessarily work, and vice versa. But I think, generally speaking, for anybody who's coming into journalism or wants to learn how to do it in the future, close the door when you can, but networking is absolutely essential. And
it's a paradox, isn't it, that, on the one hand, all this social media, internet-y stuff, means that every individual person working in news is now their own brand. I.e., if you've got a Twitter account, for example, that's you, that's your personal brand, if you like, and you can be very creative and so on through that, but that's almost worthless unless, the whole point of Twitter is you're part of a network, for example. So not just collaboration in the sense that you work with guys with other skills on particular projects, but that everything you do is potentially networked and will work better if it is, and therefore you've always got to have that sense of being reciprocal, being interactive.
Which is, ironically, the way journalism works. If you're out in the field in Gaza or something and there's 5 of you stuck in a building there and you're being shot at, you're going to collaborate with each other, right? Whether your bosses like it or not. And while there is still the sense that, BBC shouldn't be working with Al Jazeera or CNN or something, but in reality, networking has a value even at that level. And if one organization is prepared to open the door a little bit to information and knowledge from another, I think that actually benefits them. And the company, and there's also an important aspect of that, which is just in the publishing part, which is linking out. If you're writing a story now and you're not linking to other people's reporting and connecting to it, you're not doing it right. Because it cannot and should not, as Charlie says, it's a process now, not an end product. You can't just say, this is my story, and that's all you need to know.
But if it is a process, not a product, what about paywalls then?
That's a tough question. I don't know and this is why I said it'll be interesting to come back in 2 years. I have great sympathy and understanding with the large news organizations that are trying paywalls. You have to try something. But we have a paywall at Storyful, and it works. We're not necessarily always being paid what we want to get paid, but we get paid, and we create huge value. So I think if anyone who tells you that they know for sure that a paywall will work or it won't work is a liar. But anyone who says, well, paywalls absolutely will not work is not really understanding.
And even the paywall, if you look at what News International has done in Britain, and there are lots of models on the continent where newspapers have been charging either partial or complete access. Even with a paywall, that's still a process, because you're still the wall is a bit of a misnomer. There is no such thing as a totally fenced off area on the internet, and certainly within that sort of space, it is much more like a process. It's much more interactive. It's much more changing. It's much more participatory. So I think even with the paywalls, and certainly we shouldn't worry about charging. Putting a price on something doesn't make it less interactive.
Yeah, and I think that's, in some ways, I would say that's a challenge of technology, because I think there's not enough flexibility right now in the systems that we have, that the concept of a paywall sounds and is a little bit too structured right now. The flexibility that could and should happen, that when a really big story is happening, that you could lower that wall a little bit for some of your content and bring people in, and at other times you could make it higher. I think that the challenge of technology for the future of publishing is that there needs to be a very sophisticated real-time ability to adjust that way in which you share your content. But that also, the challenge of technology is to find better ways for journalists to collaborate, particularly about things like verification, in ways that are meaningful and not always public too, because networking can have a certain value if you're doing it in public, but it can also be a complete waste of time, because you get all sorts of people getting involved in the process who really don't know what they're talking about. So there is also a role, I think, for sort of a closed-door networking as well, where journalists can go and collaborate together in a space, not necessarily in public.
I have also a question about what Charlie said about trust. As long as it was a product, you had the feeling that trust was built inside the product. It comes from a major news organization, so I can trust it. Where does the trust come from now, then? Well, why should I trust anybody now?
Well, again,
I can't trust Rupert Murdoch anymore.
You shouldn't trust anybody anyway. You know that, really.
Yes, I know.
I think, quite seriously, I think we are in a world where, generally speaking, people are more sceptical, and that's often seen as a bad thing, but I actually think it's quite a good thing. I think journalists should be very sceptical, and it's great that the public are sceptical as well, and therefore you earn the trust. But again, there's another paradox going on here, which is that, and we're going to talk later, I think, about verification and so on. How does the journalist filter out all that crap? And that's when they become trusted. So there's a bit of a paradox going on, which is that some of the old media brands, BBC, for example, are actually more trusted now when we've got all that other stuff around, because people will turn to organisations with a reputation for being reliable. But I think the difference is now that it is this relationship. So who do you trust? On Facebook, for example. How many people on Facebook in this room? Right. Hands up, those of you who trust Facebook as a company. Yeah.
Yeah, we should put on the record one half hand there.
Hands up who trusts your friends on Facebook. Do you trust your friends on Facebook? Yeah, lots more, see. And that's the point. That, I don't trust my friends, my God. Most of them are journalists. But,
on or off Facebook.
Pardon?
On or off Facebook.
Yeah, on or off, yeah, exactly. Unless they're buying a drink. But, so that's the point. So trust is always negotiable, it's always provisional, but you learn to recognise people in the same way that you recognise brands by your experience, and also by their relevance to you. How do they fit in with your life? And I think that's the sort of paradox, that everything's become much more personal, and yet at the same time, we seem to entrust, for example, we all entrust our search to Google, and that seems to work too.
Yeah, and I would say that in a sense, trust is a process, because certainly in the journalism world, because yes, I trust the large news brands, and I trust some on some stories more than other stories. And I think that's actually a very important thing that we need to keep in mind, is that the consumer of information and journalism is very much more sophisticated now than they used to be. Somebody who, a news audience that used to just sort of sit at home at 6:30 and watch the news, basically took whatever they were given. But now people expect more. And so I think trust has changed a little bit in the sense that you would, as a consumer, certainly a sophisticated news consumer, you know when the news organizations are getting it right and you know when they're getting it wrong. But that doesn't mean you abandon them completely because you know that there's still value there. You know, you'd still come back because it's like a friend who let you down once. There's still something that you know you get value from. But obviously, I mean, and I'll show you just very quickly here.
Is that the hope for the Murdoch company publications in England? They failed you miserably once, and now you go back and trust them again?
I'm not going to comment on that.
Okay.
But I mean, just to take the other part of trust. So if you're looking at social media content, I won't spend too much time on this, but just this was a video, and I won't play it, but it showed bodies being thrown off a bridge in Syria. And it came out a few months ago, and people were running it all day because there was one version on the web that said it was the Syrian army throwing the bodies of Free Syrian Army rebels off a bridge, right? And it's horrible, nasty video. Well, we discovered very quickly that there was the same video, exactly the same video, was also on YouTube with a different narrative, that it was actually the rebels throwing the bodies of Syrian army off a bridge. So we started to look into it. Now, in the meantime, news organizations were running this video, some with one narrative and some with the other narrative. But we went and looked at this video and got, I won't go in detail here, but got on the ground testimony from people who told us exactly where this bridge was, got translations of everything that you could hear in it, in Arabic, in the local dialect. We spoke to Syrian interpreters, 2 different ones to get 2 different sources. We reached out to our community who are both inside Syria and outside Syria to get input, all of which we included in this entry which our news clients saw. We went on Google and worked out with our partners at Google that there is a bridge that looks exactly like that and that the bridge is right there in the area, everything except one thing. Everybody that we spoke to said that maybe that bridge and maybe that river, but it's not now because right now I'm standing at that river and it's dry as a bone because at this time of the year that river's dry. So we advised all of our news clients, keep an eye on that video, keep it, you know, we may find out more later, but don't use it right now, today. Here's 10 other videos that you can use today. But we have very reliable information that this video, we don't even know who's being thrown, but we certainly do know that it's not today. So when it comes to trust as well, and again, there's a lot more where that came from, but when it comes to trust, I think we don't trust anybody. It's trust but verify, right? In every case, both with traditional news organizations and with the people on the ground. No matter what your political sympathies are, you should verify everything.
Might want to open up to the floor here. We have 10 more minutes on this, so any question from you guys? We have a mic somewhere, no?
Okay. We can hear you probably.
Just,
It's on. Just,
Oh, it's on.
just use it.
There's a great visualization about the first tweet that Osama was killed.
Yes.
What's the moment and how does that process go that it becomes the truth and everybody starts to pick it up? It's a tweet, right? So you don't
Boy,
know.
how much time do you have? I could tell you there's a whole chapter in my book.
I wish you would, yeah.
I mean, I'll give my 2 minutes and then Charlie can input. I mean, that night when we at Storyful heard that the president was going to address the nation that night, and we had no idea what it was. All of our news company, it was a Sunday night, everybody was off, and I mean off. It was some holiday weekend in the US, and everybody was off. So we started checking, and we checked everywhere. Was it Libya, which was the most likely? Was it Pakistan? Was it Afghanistan? We were checking everything. And we picked up a couple of tweets from Pakistan, from traditional news organizations, that there had been helicopter crash in a place called Abbottabad in Pakistan, which I'd never heard of. And it seemed to us that that probably wasn't relevant to the president speaking because it was a helicopter crash in Pakistan, right? So we didn't do anything with it. But we were aware of it and we found a couple of other sources who were in Abbottabad and we thought, okay, we'll add them to our Twitter list from Pakistan and that'll be useful for the future. Well, 2 hours later, we started to get hints that it might be Osama bin Laden. We didn't know, but it might be. So we went back to our Afghanistan list and Pakistan list and looked. And just as the president was speaking, we began to see these guys who we'd added to our Twitter list were actually hours before talking about hearing helicopters over Abbottabad. And that contributed, along with a lot of other information, to us being able to advise some of our news clients who were lucky enough to have their reporters in Islamabad at the time that they should keep an eye on Abbottabad. And in some cases, that actually helped them think and plan and get there faster than others did. So I was not aware of really virtual. I don't think anyone really was, and if they say they were, they're lying. He wasn't. He didn't know what he was seeing, and I've heard him speak about it. He didn't know what he was seeing. That's not, it's a perfect example though, because that's not news. It's information. It only becomes news when it is connected to the context of what was really happening. Do you know what I mean? And that is an essential thing to understand about anyone who tells you, well, Twitter won. Twitter didn't win. A tweet is not news. A tweet is a one element in what may become news or may become nothing, So just because somebody says, well, Twitter had it first, Twitter did not have anything first. Twitter has everything first, and they have nothing first, right? But it's not news until it's connected to a whole story. And that story obviously emerged in bits and pieces too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think I agree entirely with what David's saying. What's interesting, though, is that we are now in this environment where, there is this instantaneousness about news or information, and that is quite disturbing to people. What I think is interesting is how rarely, a false statement survives very long. Interestingly, people talk about, the gay girl in Damascus blogger who was fake, but actually it's so unusual. That's what's remarkable about it. And the reason is mainly because, not just because people like Storyful or the BBC are out there fact-checking, but there's, millions of other people on Twitter who say, that's bollocks, that's not true. And I know because X, Y, Z. So actually, I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's interesting how the mechanism itself seems to cope quite well with kind of Gresham's law of driving out bad information. That doesn't mean that there isn't still distortion and emphases, and those Syrian opposition guys are really interesting. They're creating lots of interesting data, but even where their data or information or pictures are true, they are distorting, if you like, and you may think that's a great thing, because all that information is coming from them. There has been a tendency, for example, for media people not perhaps to question the Syrian opposition groups quite so strictly because they're giving you that information. So there's a sort of a balance that has to be done there. But I think in a way the problem is, I'm agreeing here with David about when data becomes whatever news is. But I think there's a bigger problem, which is the stuff that you don't get. How much does Twitter, for example, really tell us? It's most useful, of course, when it links to something, either literally in a hyperlink, or it tells you about something true. Because I think there's still actually a kind of information vacuum around stuff, that you get to know big bang stuff. But I still think the big challenge for the rest of the people talking in this conference, and perhaps the people in the room, is to bring more data actually out. I think we should worry less about... we should never stop worrying about verification, but we should worry less about the fake information. I'm just more worried about why isn't there more information out there, more background detail, more in-depth stuff, more stuff that we're not supposed to know, like with the WikiLeaks revelations.
Or maybe coming back to the comment there was a very nice effort from The Guardian on tweeting, looking at the London riots and how tweets were running and how tweets were fake or wrong tweets and how that changed over time. And they won actually the Data Journalism Prize I mentioned in the very beginning. And it's a huge mapping effort of following false tweets throughout the London riots. Yep. One, for example, was the animals in the zoo have been released. And the other one was people are cooking their own food at McDonald's. And that lasted for about 25 minutes or something. And then you could see how this was... how it changed around, and it made this huge mapping. I think they looked at 2 million tweets or something, a huge effort there.
Well, we were doing that in real time. And if I was the British police, and I think they've done it now, the lesson learned from that was there was more good, accurate information in the first hour or two if you were paying attention on the London riots on Twitter than anywhere else. But after about 2 hours, and this happens on every story, that's when the crap and the fakes and the stupidity started happening. And that's why there's a sort of what we call a golden hour when a story breaks, whether it's Osama bin Laden or London riots or whatever it is. If you're a journalist and you can connect in that golden hour, then you are much more likely to get accurate information. Although still, we do a sort of half joking but half serious regular thing called #DailyDebunk, whenever there's a death announcement on Twitter, which that happens pretty much every day, whether it's Margaret Thatcher or whoever it is. I mean, it's almost not worth doing anymore because they're so obviously fakes. But there's this particular guy who's out there, he's a professor, calls himself a professor, you know, putting out fake tweets with fake Twitter accounts saying, you know, so-and-so's died. And it's almost not worth verifying them because they're so stupid. But he has a point in some ways, unfortunately, which is that, you know, a fake tweet goes just as far as a non-fake tweet. And so whether you like it or not, as journalists, you have to be aware of those kinds of things. Is that for every great tweet like Really Virtual in Pakistan, there's 1,000 other idiots out there putting completely fake information. One of the things, though, I will say is that anyone who does not know how to check the origin of images that they see online is not being a responsible consumer, let alone a journalist. And it is very easy. There are very easily available tools from Google and TinEye and everybody else that if you see a picture that says, here's Hurricane Isaac with massive clouds coming into Florida, just install the right tool on your browser and you will be able to tell in 2 seconds whether that image is real or not. It's a very simple thing, and that's not just a skill for journalists, that's a skill as a consumer, because that really annoys me when fake images just spread like wildfire because nobody's checked them.
Do you think that Twitter and other social networks like Facebook and so on have only value of information? Because I remember, for example, for me it was very interesting to follow Twitters or some friends in Facebook who are in Cairo at the time where the revolution began, because I wanted actually to hear about their emotions and feelings and things like that, which you wouldn't write in any newspaper, even on your portal.
Sure. You want to take that, Charlie? Or just
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with you. I think one of the fascinating things about this sort of new media environment is, in the past, you know, when I was working at the BBC, for example, the idea of news was that it was almost like a kind of like a product, but it was like a substance. It was like a metal. It was like stainless steel. There was that thing, and it had no other characteristics except the factual narrative, the truth. You know, that was the thing. But of course, we all experience narratives. We all experience news in very many ways. Like the photo I showed you of the family. People are experiencing it as professionals. They're experiencing it as personal, you know, emotionally. We're experiencing it intellectually, socially. That's how we experience news and information. And of course, that's why we all love social media and social networks, because we get that data, that information in a way that's incredibly human. It goes right back to those basic ideas about why we communicate in the first place. Here's a secret. You don't need to know the news. 95% of the news is not really material to your lives. So what you know about Syria? What difference is that going to make? Are you going to go to Syria? Are you going to, you know, it may be you'll vote differently slightly. You know, it may be you'll donate some money, but quite possibly not. So why do you need to know? Why do you watch it? There are all sorts of reasons for that. And I think social media reflects that much more human, diverse approach to news. And that's quite disturbing for traditional journalists, that people do that. So my answer would be that those platforms are much more than just, you know, I would never say just emotional or just personal. I think that's absolutely essential to understanding the relevance of what we used to call news to real people.
Yeah, I would agree. And I mean, you talking about Egypt, I just brought up, we have a curated Twitter list for every country in the world and every story going on. And so I haven't looked at the Egypt one today. You mentioned Egypt, I'll just bring it up. And there are dozens and dozens of people on here, all of whom are in Egypt, and they're talking about what's happening. I don't know what's happening in Egypt right now, but clearly something is. But the layers of personal context that you get by following the right people, not just traditional journalists, but local journalists or local people who would love to be journalists. I don't give a toss, by the way, whether somebody calls themselves a journalist or not. They either do journalism or they don't, no matter what their title is. But if you create a really nice list of people that are a combination of all of those things, it connects you not just to a story, but to a place. I've been to Cairo many times, but most people are not lucky enough to have that. You can go to Egypt if you curate that story properly. And you can see people tweeting about the news, but you can also see them tweeting about their families and their brothers and their sisters and about the government and all of those things. And I think it's exactly your point, is it makes it more than a story. It makes it a human interaction. Even if you never actually meet those people, you then can actually connect to their experience in a way that, again, you know, the best news article in the world cannot bring you that close. So I think it's information, but it's also people.
We have time for 2 more, 3 more.
How would you see the role of various new technologies in this process of semi-automating event detection, eyewitness detection, and verification of the information on the social media?
Well, I'll give a quick answer and then think about it a little bit, because I think, you know, it's a very, very good question. The scale of content that's out there demands automation of some parts of this. It is not humanly possible. I certainly know it's not humanly possible for 30+ people at Storyful, or even the hundreds or thousands at all of the news organizations, to look at and verify every single piece of content. So the more automation that there is, the better. I would, however, argue that the real role for automation at this point is in taking out of the equation things that just you shouldn't even be looking at. So in other words, if you're interested in looking at Syria, then there are already, and there should be more, systems that automatically sort of tell you, okay, this person is talking about Syria, but they're not actually there. Or, you know, this Syria is mentioned here, but it's not actually directly relevant to what's happening in Syria. So I suppose to sum that up, relevance is the enemy of journalism, or certainly the enemy of breaking news right now, because relevance is really about hundreds of thousands of people mentioning a piece of information or a piece of video. But what I think automation the real need for automation is to capture images and information really early in the cycle and be able to just take them off so that they're not relevant anymore. Because the other part of that question is that I would love there to be more automation, but believe me, if it was there, we would have found it. We're really working hard at Storyful to find ways to automate some of the processes we've developed. And in some cases, in some areas, we've achieved that. But in other areas, and again, this is the market opportunity for journalists, is that it's still essential to have a human eye on it. So I think in some ways the way it scales is take the 80, 85, 90% of stuff out of the equation that you shouldn't even be looking at. In the 10% that's worth looking at, automation is needed, but I think the human eye still plays a very key role.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly add, you know, automating to what purpose? You know, when you say to verify, what do we mean by that? Do we mean that it's true? You know, Charlie Beckett is in Amsterdam. We can verify that. But what about the statement, Charlie Beckett is talking rubbish in Amsterdam? How do we verify that? Difficult to automate it. You could do it by the balance of negative or positive tweets, some kind of sentiment analysis. But that's quite difficult because, you know, how you gauge that, you making assumptions about that. So I think that it's not just it's a sort of human thing, but also a sort of political element here about how, you know, what it is that you are verifying, and that makes it very difficult to automate, which is great news, you know, if you want a career in journalism as a human being.
I will say that I think the web companies can probably do a better job of harnessing the power of the kind of curation that we do and other news organizations do on their platforms to help the general audience access information in a way that is filtered to a certain extent. And what I mean by that is that journalism is happening on Twitter, and journalism is happening on Facebook, and it's happening on all of these platforms. But as a general consumer, it's not always easy to know that or to find that. And so I think maybe in terms of automation, I still think that journalism is required to do a lot of the verification, but I do think the web companies can do a better job of sort of showing that off when that is done, when journalism is being done, you know, amateur or professional journalism is being done, and making that easier to access for people. Because I think the play that most web companies have is scale. They don't want to filter anything or compartmentalize anything because it's all about scale. But I think that the real challenge for them going forward is it can't just be about scale. It has to be easier for people, anybody, to find quality, reliable information on these web platforms. And right now, that's, journalists are doing that, but it's not always easy to find it.
I can take one more.
Hi, thank you very much for everything you said. I agree with almost everything up until the point where you said that 95% of the news is not relevant.
Pardon?
That 95% of the news is not relevant. And I was just wondering, this is a chance for journalists because Syria is related to our lives here in the West as well. Because money that is in our pension plans is being invested in the companies that produce the weapons that are being used there. And that's not often, stories like that are not often produced by news media. And I think if journalists would do that, they would show their own relevance by showing the relevance of the news to people.
Yeah, no, I'm going to agree with you and disagree with myself. I've got problems.
You are in fact talking rubbish. So
I am in fact. We've just verified.
We've verified that.
We've just
That's
verified
what we
that. Yeah.
2 sources.
Exactly. And I spent my whole career desperately trying to convince people to be interested in something that they wouldn't normally be interested in. Boy, have I worked on some very boring topics, and one of the things that excites me about new media technologies is the ability to find someone in this room who is going to be interested in a particular topic. I'll be able to find somebody in here, for example, who might be interested in, my football team, West Ham United. It's unlikely, but I bet you I can find one person in here who will be. But what my point was, it's a sort of countering the idea that all of us can know about everything all the time and care, or be, deeply not. That's just impossible, and I think it's pointless. The idea, for example, that everyone should care about every suffering in the world. The hidden war. The secret war syndrome. There is a secret war in the Congo. Well, there's also a secret war in Somalia. There's a secret war, here. There's a secret war in Chechnya. There's lots of secret wars. You can't care about all of them, even though I could find a way to connect it back to your pension fund, your trading, or simply out of humanity, out of common, you've got children, well, there are children suffering everywhere in the world. So my point is that we have to be realistic, and this is the report that I mentioned that I've got coming out in November, which is a much more analytical look at this idea. And I look at it in a kind of humanitarian point of view, Can you convince everyone to care? Well, I don't think you can, and you shouldn't. You should try and convince you that care about and have a connection to Syria to care about that. You that care about, immigrants in Rotterdam. Let's get you to care about that, say, or be interested in. And I think that in a sense is a technical task. It's how do you connect people to their interests. But it's also, I think, one about, and I think this is your point, it's about better journalism. It's looking deeper at certain issues and coming out with the information that makes them relevant or interesting to people, rather than the other way around, which is the topless Kate Middleton syndrome, that you put stuff in, you go look where the traffic is, and that's where you put your journalism. Now, that's the easiest thing to do. You can automate that. But to do, what Storyful does, for example, which helps to dig deeper, make it more multidimensional, means that it's more likely to become relevant. But as I say, you've got to be cautious. In a cheap way, this is a cheap remark in a sense, but a lot of us watch news, for example, or consume news for entertainment. Let's be honest, we don't always consume news because we think it's going to be important to us or that we're going to do something about it. And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think there's anybody should be ashamed of producing news or consuming it simply because it's interesting. I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I would say absolutely agree with your point and your context there, is that the fallacy is that everybody should care about and be able to consume all of this information all at the same time. That's just not realistic, and it's not even really useful because your head will explode. And believe me, my head gets close to that all the time. Our jobs are what I call applied attention deficit disorder, because you're concentrating on 1,000 things at the same time. But however, the opportunity of a lot of what we're talking about here. We've talked about the challenges a lot, but the opportunity for not just journalism, but news and information in general, is that you actually, if you know what you're doing, and certainly if journalism plays its part, and maybe academia plays its part as well, and the web companies play their part, there is the opportunity to create really useful, very comprehensive ways to consume information about the one thing you care about in a way that just was not possible before. You know, I used to stay up late to watch the documentary that was on Channel 4 News at 11 o'clock. That was the only way I could ever find out anything about the story I cared about. Well, now I could, if I have the time, sit and look at particular websites or Twitter lists or anything and just sit there all day consuming information about the story that I'm interested in. So I think the fallacy is that everyone should care about everything, or that news companies should somehow or other sort of supply, you know, really, you know, expansive coverage on every single subject, but only on this sort of a level, very surface level. What I think is really important is that news companies who've invested in the right things, which is really good storytelling and really compelling journalists who get on the ground and can make you care about a, you know, story like Arwa Damon can make you care about what's happening in Syria because she's there. That's what they should be doing. You know, they should also have a website that has stories about Syria. But I think there's an opportunity also to have, outside of those news, just a single news organization, the ability to access all of the information I want about Syria, not just Arwa's piece and not just the article in the New York Times and not just the user-generated content, but all of it in one place. And I think actually that's really not just the future of news, but the future of information and certainly the future of search. Because right now if you're Google and you're searching for Syria, the only things that are indexed are essentially traditional news organizations, right? They're missing a whole section of information that's out there, including in some cases their own stuff on YouTube, because it hasn't been indexed and isn't really searchable in that way on Google News. So I think the challenge is, fallacy is, you know, let's get everybody to care about everything. Not necessarily true, but the opportunity is that you can now, with these web platforms and with proper verification, create really interesting, dynamic experiences on the particular story that somebody is interested in. And I think that's a huge opportunity for journalism. It's local journalism, or it's in a particular area or a particular vertical. There's no barrier to that. The barrier of entry to journalism is so low now that you could do it if you harness it properly, curate it properly.
I think we should leave it at that. Thank you very much for a very great discussion. I liked it quite a lot.
Right.
And Charlie, for your benefit, you did not talk rubbish in Amsterdam. So.